What you are looking at is side-by-side footage of a 9070 XT running The Witcher 3 on Windows and Linux. At 4K Ultra, the 9070 XT is near 60 FPS on Windows, with performance on Linux trailing by 24%. The Linux distro used is KashiOS, which is based on Arch Linux. At 1440p, the gap is narrowed somewhat, with performance on Windows and Linux very similar. I'll talk about the kernel, firmware and driver versions to get the 9070 XT working later in this video. Ray tracing performance on Linux at 1440p lags behind Windows somewhat, which is something we'll see repeated in other games I'm looking at. I'll have detailed charts following the footage showing not only 9070 XT performance, but also versus the 4080 Super. As a PlayStation title, you would expect Horizon Forbidden West to be well optimized on AMD hardware, and that is the case here, which we will see when I compare the results to the 4080 Super later. But performance on Linux lags behind Windows here by 15%. Performance at 1440p is closer, though much of this can be explained by the 12600K I used for this testing, bottlenecking the 9070 XT on Windows. The 9070 XT is truly high-end, so I would recommend the best CPU you can afford. Silent Hill 2 sees performance on Linux get close to Windows performance at 4K high settings. Now, one thing I want to point out that you may have noticed is the GPU clock speed. The Gigabyte Aorus Elite model I am testing is an OC model with an extra 130 MHz factory overclock. You may also notice that Mango HUD on KashiOS is often reporting a slightly higher clock speed than Afterburner is on Windows. The power usage of the GPU can vary a lot also. It was reporting 340 watts of usage on Linux at 4K, but only around 250 watts here at 1440p. I'm not sure what to make of that. With RT turned on, the reported usage goes back over 300 watts. This footage shows that a good RT 60 plus FPS experience can be had with these settings at 1440p on Linux, but look at that performance on Windows. It's very impressive. In Hogwarts Legacy, a good 60 plus FPS experience can be enjoyed at 4K Ultra native resolution on Linux, though it lags Windows performance by 16%. Another thing I noted about this Aorus Elite model is just how cool it runs, in the low to mid 50s. At 1440p Ultra, the FPS is close, but if you look at the GPU usage, you will see that the CPU is bottlenecking performance on Windows. You can use the respective GPU utilization percentages as a barometer of how much Windows performance would be ahead with a more powerful CPU. With maximum RT turned on, we see performance lagging on Linux, particularly in the 1% lows. I will be doing more testing with the 9070 XT in a lot more games using a 7800 X3D CPU. But now, let's get into some charts and discuss relative performance against the 4080 Super. So I'll begin with looking at the test system specification. Now, the CPU I used was an i5 12600K. Now, that's not ideal, but the Linux PC I had available to me had this CPU. Now, I will do more testing with a 7800 X3D CPU, and we'll really put the 9070 XT and 4080 Super to their paces and see what the true performance of these GPUs would be. But this was still plenty to get some testing done and have a look at some relative performance between Windows and Linux. So we have 32 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 CL18 memory. We're using NVMe SSDs, Gen 4 speeds, and we are on Linux using KashiOS with KDE Plasma 6.3.3. We're using a 6.13.7 kernel, and you do need to use a minimum of 6.13.5 to support the 9070 XT. On the AMD driver side, we're using Mesa 25.1.0 drivers, and I had to get this directly from AUR Git. Now, AUR is a repository for Arch packages, and it allows you to get basically bleeding edge packages that are not quite in the main branch yet, but do allow you to access the latest updates and so on. And the same goes for Linux firmware. I got the Linux firmware Git version, which is dated up to the 11th of March, and that makes sure that the version of the Linux firmware knows about the 9070 XT. If you use earlier versions of the firmware, it just won't recognize the GPU. Now for the 4080 Super, again using the latest version of the Linux driver, 570.124.04. And on the Windows side, we're using the latest update for 24H2. We're using the latest NVIDIA graphics driver and the very latest AMD graphics driver Adrenalin 2531, which supports the 9070 XT. So I'll begin the charts with a game that I wasn't able to capture footage for on Linux. Now, I did get some benchmarking done prior to the crashing, and it's a bit weird because normally you'd expect things to be either stable or crashing all the time, but for some reason initially I was able to benchmark Cyberpunk, and then later on when I returned to do my footage capture using my capture card, etc., it just continually crashed no matter what I did. And I wanted to use the built-in benchmark so that I could get kind of consistent results from one run to the next. Now if we do look at the results I was able to benchmark, we'll see that at 1440p Ultra there's probably a little bit of CPU bottlenecking going on, but we do see that the 9070 XT on both Linux and Windows is getting us around 120 FPS, and it's edging out the 4080 Super, particularly on Linux, which is a very promising result for the 9070 XT, particularly on Linux. If we look at the RT side of things though, we do see that the 4080 Super on Linux does significantly outperform what the 9070 XT can do on Linux, and I suppose that's not to be unexpected. But what is interesting though is on Windows, the 9070 XT does get quite close to the 4080 Super. It's within 20%, so I would say that's basically 4070 Ti type performance, which I think isn't too bad. It's certainly a very good generational leap compared to RDNA 3. And if we move on to 4K, very interesting results here. We do see the 9070 XT on Linux outperforming the 4080 Super. And again, even on Windows, we see the 9070 XT slightly outperforming the 4080 Super. So that's a very good sign for this new RDNA 4 GPU. If we look at the Witcher 3 performance at 1440p Ultra, we see that the 9070 XT on Windows is getting quite close to the 4080 Super. Again, on a kind of price to performance basis, that's a very encouraging result. It's within a very few percent of the 4080 Super. And on Linux, we see a very significant win over the 4080 Super for the 9070 XT. And the 9070 XT gets quite close to Windows on Linux, and I don't think CPU has much to do with it based on the GPU utilization, so I think that's very encouraging. When we turn on maximum RT at 1440p, we do see that the 4080 Super does pull out a little bit of a lead, but again, it's not a massive lead, though it is a bigger lead on Linux, as we will see consistently that RT performance on Linux for the 9070 XT is lagging a bit behind where we hope it might end up in the future. And when we move on to 4K Ultra, again we see very, very similar performance. The 9070 XT on Windows is only very slightly behind the 4080 Super, and it lags a little bit on Linux, but not by a whole lot, I would say. In Horizon Forbidden West, as you'd expect with a PlayStation sponsored title, we see that the AMD hardware here, the 9070 XT, does have a bit of a lead over the 4080 Super, which is a very nice lead. We see that on both Windows and Linux. There's a very nice little win here for the 9070 XT. And at 4K, very high settings, we see that again on both Windows and Linux, the 9070 XT does edge it over the 4080 Super. In Hogwarts Legacy, we see quite a significant win here for the 9070 XT on Windows and Linux over the 4080 Super. As you might expect, when we turn on Maximum RT, the 9070 XT begins to struggle a little bit, and we see that on Windows it trails the 4080 Super by quite a margin. Now when we move to 4K without RT, we see quite a close thing here. We see a virtual tie on both Linux and Windows, and again, very encouraging for the 9070 XT here. Now, Silent Hill 2 is a game I've noticed where Nvidia does seem to have an edge over AMD. For whatever reason, the game seems to be optimized better for Nvidia hardware. And we see here that on Windows at 1440p epic settings, we see a nice lead here for the 4080 Super, but again on Linux, we actually see a slight lead for Linux for the 9070 XT, though the 1% lows were a little bit worse, but this is a game that can be quite stuttery, so the 1% lows can vary quite a lot, so it's difficult to read too much into the 1% lows on these charts. Now for the RT test, I put the settings down to medium to make sure that I could get 60 plus FPS performance, and I did manage that even on Linux on the 9070 XT with 61.7 FPS. We do see that it trails the 4080 Super on Linux a little bit, but not a massive amount, I would say. I think that's quite encouraging. And again, the same thing with the 9070 XT on Windows. It doesn't trail the 4080 Super by all that much. Again, I would say this is kind of like 4070 Ti Super level performance perhaps. Now at 4K high settings, again I'm trying to make sure that I get close to that 60 FPS performance, and we do with the 4080 Super on Windows with 65.4. Now the others do fall a little bit behind 60, but we do see that the 9070 XT falls a bit further behind at 4K on Windows, but again on Linux, because the 4080 Super and Nvidia GPUs in general do tend to have that kind of 20+% penalty on Linux, we do see that the 9070 XT actually draws just about level with the 4080 Super. Now, bearing in mind that 5 games isn't a massive sample size, if we do put all of the results that we got for the 9070 XT into a single chart, this is what we get here. And we can see that Linux performance relative to Windows is, it's pretty negative for the most part, not always very negative, but if we look at the bottom here, we'll see that I've put the GeoMean with and without ray tracing switched on at the bottom here, and we see that without RT we're looking at about minus 10%, and when we switch on RT and include that, it grows to about 16% overall. Individual RT results, as you will see, can be quite large. We see 28, 33 and 40% deficits, which isn't great, but I suppose not surprising, and hopefully this is something that will be improved in future driver updates. But as bad as that is, if we look at the situation with the 4080 Super, we'll see that actually the differences are even larger, and we'll see that on average, like previous results I've found with the 3060 Ti and the 1080, we are looking at that 20% plus negative result on Linux versus Windows. Now, what if we compare the 9070 XT and the 4080 Super just on Linux? And we'll see some interesting results here. We actually see a win for the 9070 XT despite some very large deficits in ray tracing results. We actually see that overall without RT, it's about 10% ahead, and even when you include RT, it does eke out a slight win against the 4080 Super. Now, if we compare the 9070 XT to the RTX 4080 Super on Windows, we actually see that when you exclude RT, there's virtual parity, barely a difference between them. And even when you include RT, there's only a relatively small or modest minus 6.3% difference there. So all in all, I think this is a very impressive result for the 9070 XT, particularly considering the price to performance. With the version that I bought was €869. The 4080 Super I got was actually discounted to €1,079, but even allowing for those prices, there's much better price to performance. But when you go back to MSRP, then that's an even bigger win for the 9070 XT. Okay, so I'm going to bring this to a conclusion. I'm going to summarize everything that I've done so far and all the testing I've done, and I am very impressed with the 9070 XT. Even with the Linux performance being a bit behind where I hoped it might have been, I think, given the history of improvements that have happened over the years to the Mesa drivers, I have no doubt that performance will improve dramatically over the coming weeks and months. Would I recommend getting a 9070 XT if you're intending to use it solely for Linux? I'd say it's a bit early for that. I think there are a few stability issues. You'll get the odd crash here and there. You know, it's really up to yourself. Are you comfortable with the odd crash here and there? I mean, it was fairly stable. It really was. Cyberpunk was the main culprit trying to run the benchmark. Your mileage may vary. I did have one or two other crashes, but by and large, I would say it was actually pretty stable, given how early we are in its life cycle. So yeah, it's up to yourself. How comfortable are you with a GPU that might have the occasional crash? If you're okay with that, and you're okay with occasionally having to press in your power button for 10 seconds to get the thing shut off and restarted, then, you know, if you're okay with that, by all means get it. If you're dual booting, then absolutely no issue. You'll get the best of both worlds. And, you know, if it's just Windows you're looking at, then really it is a very impressive GPU when you consider the price of it and how close it gets in performance to the 4080 Super, often beating it, and getting, for me, surprisingly close in the ray tracing results. Now, when it comes to path tracing, of course, it still gets blown out of the water, but that's a few games, and path tracing is not something you have to turn on. It is, by and large, an NVIDIA sponsored feature, so if you're okay with a little bit of FOMO on that side of things, then I definitely highly recommend the 9070 XT. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video and you like this type of content, do please consider subscribing. I do love getting into the comments down below. I like getting into conversations with people about Linux and gaming and looking at all your suggestions. So any comments down below would be very, very welcome. And of course, like this video, help boost its profile in the YouTube algorithm and boost Linux gaming content in general. And with that, I hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye.